Chapter 7. A Sad Goodbye. Sam found Dr. Loring and brought him to Sarah's wagon. Dr. Loring climbed up to check on her parents, but it wasn't long before he returned. "It's the cholera. I'm afraid they're both too far gone," Dr. Loring whispered to Ma so Sarah couldn't hear. But Sam heard. His eyes stung with tears and his throat got tight. The guidebooks all warned this trip was dangerous, and Sam knew that plenty of folks died out on the trail. But until now, they'd been nameless strangers, not people with actual voices and faces and hands Sam had shaken. Dr. Loring sat beside Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson all night long. Sam and Ma stayed up with Sarah, worrying and wondering. Ranger stayed, too, curled up next to Sarah by the campfire. He leaned his big, warm body against her. Ranger understood sad. He remembered when Luke and Sadie's grandmother had died, and everyone cried. He understood there wasn't much you could do about that. In the morning, Dr. Loring came to the Abbott's wagon. Sarah jumped up and started toward him. Dr. Loring shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so very sorry." Sam watched Ma and Pa and Mr. Harrigan and the Beard brothers dig a grave for Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson. Ma tried to keep Sarah away, but she insisted on watching too. She never cried, but Sam heard her whispering numbers. She counted every spadeful of dirt, all the way up to 237. She watched as they laid her mother and father down in the prairie, said some prayers, and shoveled all that dirt back in. And then it was time to go. Sam felt like there should be more ceremony, more prayers, and more time. But there were miles to be covered. They had to get through the mountains before winter. So Pa hitched up the oxen. He shouted, "Get on, Fergus! Get on, Jed!" like he did every morning. The men drove every last wagon over the grave as if they were saying goodbye, but Sam knew the real reason. He'd heard the men talking about wolves. Running the wagons over the grave packed the earth so it was more likely Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson would rest in peace. Sarah walked beside Sam and Ranger. She was part of the Abbott family for now. Ma had promised to take care of her until they got to the parting of the ways where the trails split. There, Sarah's parents had planned to take the Mormon Trail to the Salt Lake Valley, where her Uncle Aaron and Aunt Helen and all those cousins were waiting to help them settle at the new farm. When the Abbotts got to the next fort, Ma planned to send a message to Sarah's relatives so they could come meet them and take Sarah to her new home by the Great Salt Lake. Every day that passed put more miles between Sarah and her parents' grave. She collected buffalo chips with Sam and Lizzie for the campfire each night, but she was quiet, as if part of her had died too. Only the prairie dogs made her smile. "They're curious creatures, aren't they?" Lizzie watched with Sarah as one little fellow peeked out of his hole, half squirrel and half puppy dog. Ranger liked the prairie dogs too. They'd stand at the openings to their burrows, barking as the wagons approached. Prairie dogs weren't as much fun as squirrels at Luke's house, though. Squirrels raced around the yard and over the picnic table and zigzagged through the garden. Prairie dogs jumped into their holes and vanished as soon as Ranger came near. Still, Ranger couldn't resist chasing a few along the way. He never got so carried away that he lost sight of Amelia, though. He stayed close to all the children when the wagon train crossed creeks in the daytime. He kept track of them when the wagons circled at night. Ranger had come to love Sam and the rest of the Abbotts and Sarah, but he never stopped missing his home family. Each night before he went to sleep, Ranger took a walk through the wagons, sniffing the evening air. He'd smell oxen and horses and simmering stew, but never what he hoped for most, because Luke wasn't there. Each morning meant the start of another long walk. Sam tracked every mile in his father's guidebook. He looked forward to the landmarks Mr. Palmer had promised along the way. When Chimney Rock came into view, Sam nudged Sarah and pointed. "It's just as Mr. Palmer said," like a haystack with the pole sticking out the top. Sarah nodded, but she didn't smile. Sam had thought seeing the famous Chimney Rock might make her happier. It was a sign they were getting closer to their new home. But when Sam thought about it, he understood. He couldn't imagine settling into a new home without Ma and Pa. 4 days later, the Abbotts and the rest of their wagon train arrived at Fort Loramie, a supply post about 1/3 of the way to the Oregon Territory. They traveled more than 600 miles from Missouri, but the flurry of activity reminded Sam of independence all over again. The air was alive with excited voices and the clang of hammers as the blacksmith went about shoeing horses and oxen. There must have been 200 wagons along the Lakota Sioux men who had come on horses to trade. Travelers could buy flour, coffee, sugar, tobacco, powder, and lead at the fort. The Abbotts and the rest of their wagon train only camped near the fort one night. Ma sent her message off to Sarah's uncle and aunt, and they started out again in the morning. After Fort Laramie, there was another river crossing. It was deeper and faster than the others had been. Pa thought they could make it, but Ma shook her head. "This current's too fast. It's dangerous," she said. So Pa paid $5 to have each wagon crossed over on a ferry boat. Sam, Sarah, Lizzie, Ma, Amelia, and baby Isaac rode in canoes with Lakota men. Ranger came too. He stayed close to Amelia to keep her from leaning too far over the swirling water. "Here we are, safe and sound," Sam said after they'd all made it across. Ranger leaned in so Sam could pet him, but through all these days and miles, he kept wondering when his work would be done. When would Luke come and say, "Good job, boy," and scratch his ears and set out his water bowl? When would it be time to go home?